Buona tarda, good evening. Sorry for the wait, we had to make some pictures, as you all see. So, on behalf of the government of Andorra and the Barcelona School of Economics, I want to welcome you all to the lecture that Professor Benjamin Moll will deliver as part of the celebration of the Calvó-Armengol International Prize. A warm welcome to the family and friends of Tony Calvó-Armengol, and especially to his wife Goretti and to his two sons, Jan and Thomas. The Calvó-Armengol International Prize, as you probably know, was established to honor the memory of Antoni Calvó-Armengol, one of the most promising academics of our community, BSc-affiliated professor and ICREA UAB professor, and one of the best researchers of Andorra, where he was born. Tony passed away unexpectedly in 2007, and he was only 37. The prize aims to reflect how was Tony when he left us, a young scientist, full of energy, creative, academically rigorous, internationally recognized, and at the same time socially committed. That is aligned with the profile of the awardees of the prize, that the jury over the years has guaranteed doing an excellent job. In this way, the prize has built a solid reputation and visibility. It is now, I would say, an aspiration for young researchers in economics to be awarded the Calvó-Armengol Prize. I want to thank this year's jury, Professor Antonio Cabrales, who was with us yesterday, acting as president, Melissa Dell, Ben Golub, and Joan Llull. Joan is with us today, and he will do the profile of Benjamin Moll, the profile of Ben. Ben, of course, is the winner of the 8th edition, so this is our 8th edition. I would like to give our gratitude to, as a whole community of BSc, to the government of Andorra, today represented by Margarita Feña, who is head of research at the Ministry of Education and Higher Education of the government of Andorra, who have been sharing with the BSc the initiative and the values and objectives of the prize. Together, we have built over these years a very strong and prestigious prize that is an international reference. Let me recall the awardees of previous editions: Professors Esther Duflo, Roland Fryer, Rak Shetty, Matthew Genso, Melissa Dell, Ben Golub, and Stephanie Stancheva. Finally, I would like to give my most sincere congratulations to the awardee of this 8th edition of the Calvó-Armengol International Prize, Benjamin Moll, professor at the London School of Economics. Congratulations. I will not talk about Professor Moll's influential research, because that will be done by Joan Llull, so member of the jury, so I invite Joan to the stage. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks, Teresa. So it's been a privilege for me to serve on the jury together with Antonio, Melissa, and Ben Golub to award this wonderful prize that honors Tony to Benjamin Moll, to Ben Moll. And it's an honor to be here today introducing himself and his lecture. So as you know, beyond being a remarkable macroeconomic theorist, Tony was a very broad thinker who deeply cared about how social interaction shaped the economy. And this is why we as a jury thought that if the prize was ever to be awarded to a macroeconomist, there could be no better way to honor Tony than awarding this to a very broad economist like Ben. So let me begin highlighting some aspects of Ben's impressive CV before I will summarize a little bit some of his main contributions. So Ben graduated from the University of Chicago in 2010 after having obtained his bachelor from UCL in 2005. So following his PhD, Ben worked at Princeton for 10 years, becoming full professor in 2018. And he then joined the London School of Economics in 2019, where he's currently a professor. So Ben has published in essentially all top 5 journals. And in fact, I think one of the only things that Ben is not good at is failing to land papers in top 5 journals. So the majority of his papers end up there. And I think he's getting like an average of more than 1 top 5 publication since he started. So Ben is also a tremendous public good provider. So he supervised 25 theses. He's taught numerous courses, undergraduate, graduate, and he's currently co-editor of the AER. On top of that, he's been previously served as associate editor of Econometrica, board member of Vistat, co-editor of AJ Macro, and associate editor of the JME. He's also council member of the EEA, program chair of this year's EEA SM meetings in Rotterdam, and a member of the Yermak Makfal expert group on Russian sanctions. So he's made very significant contributions to macroeconomics. One of the things that sets Ben apart is his clear and impactful footprint in the field, particularly to his groundbreaking work on the role of heterogeneity among individuals and the constraints that they face in macroeconomic policy design. So Ben's work has provided profound insights into how economic disparities arise and persist, and on how policy interventions can mitigate these effects. So his innovative use of heterogeneous agents models have advanced our understanding of wealth inequality, income distribution, and economic growth, making his contributions both theoretical reach and practically relevant. One of the hallmarks of Ben's work is his ability to blend rigorous theoretical modeling with empirical analysis. So this approach allows him to address complex questions with nuanced answers, bringing a gap between abstract economic theory and real-world applications. So very briefly summarizing Ben's contributions, I think that they can be grouped in 3 major areas. So the first one would be in the world of financial frictions and economic development. So his groundbreaking paper, Productivity Losses from Financial Frictions, published in the AER in 2014, revolutionized our understanding of collateral constraints and their long-lasting impacts for macroeconomic steady states. So this research demonstrates that financial frictions, even if small, and even when they disappear over time, can have important implications in the short and to medium run. So after another significant contribution of this paper is showing that heterogeneity can be managed by a model that remains relatively simple and tractable, overcoming a major analytical and quantitative challenge. The second group of his contributions would be on income inequality dynamics. So Ben's meticulous analysis of income inequality is evident in his Econometrica papers, The Dynamics of Inequality in 2016, and Uneven Growth, Automation's Impact on Income and Wealth Inequality of 2022, and his Review of Economic Studies paper, Income and Wealth Distribution in Macroeconomics, A Continuous Time Approach, also in 22. So the first and third papers develop new models to examine the dynamics of inequality and its significant impacts on our macroeconomics, on our macroeconomies and societies. And the second Econometrica paper explores a new channel through which automation can influence inequality by affecting the returns to capital, demonstrating that automation can lower real wages in the long run, especially for workers whose skills are less valuable after automation. And I think perhaps the last, but definitely not the least, and maybe one of the most well-known contributions of Ben is on heterogeneous agents in Keynesian models. So perhaps the introduction of his seminal work on monetary policy according to HANG, which stands for that, Heterogeneous Agents, New Keynesian Models, published in the AER in 2018, elucidates the critical role of heterogeneity for monetary policy. So by accounting for heterogeneity, the paper shows that changes in the interest rate have very minimal impact on consumption for many individuals who are not saving at all, while those with large amounts of wealth experience significant portfolio changes. So this novel perspective have profound policy implications, suggesting, for example, that a sharp and shortcut in interest rates may be more beneficial than a long-run persistent cut. I think most of macroeconomists here in the room, especially working on new Keynesian models, would say that we could not understand today's new Keynesian models without Ben's work. So before giving the floor to Ben, just let me highlight a funny curiosity here. I promise Ben I will do that. So out of 4 people in the jury, it turns out that Ben shares the first name with one of them, Ben Golub, and he shares the ending family name with double L, like 2 of us, Melissa, Dell, and I. Of course, we didn't take that into account in our consideration because Ben's work stands on its own. Okay? So without further ado, let me please join me in welcoming the 8th Calvó-Armengol laureate, Professor Benjamin Moll. Congrats, Ben.
Thank you very much, Johan, for this extremely kind, sort of overly kind introduction. So it's an immense privilege and great honor to be here this evening to give this Calvó-Armengol lecture and to receive this extremely prestigious prize, which is named in honor of Tony, especially to do so in the presence of Tony's family and friends. Thank you also to the government of Andorra and the Barcelona School of Economics for setting up the prize, and to the selection committee for bestowing it on me. And thanks very much to all the people who worked really hard to make this such a wonderful event. Also the ceremony in Andorra yesterday, so Anna in particular, thank you very much. So this prize really is a wonderful institution. What a great way in particular of memorizing the life and work of Tony Calvó-Armengol. I've been a long-time fan and an admirer of Tony's work ever since reading some of his papers back in graduate school. And receiving this prize gave me an opportunity to look back at some of these papers again, and I was sort of struck again by just how creative, elegant, and relevant, and also sort of ahead of their time they are. So I work in macroeconomics, which is in a sense a completely different field from Tony's field of specialization, which is network theory and economic theory more broadly. But actually, Tony's work has lots of relevance for macroeconomics, and I just wanted to show you one example of this. Sorry, I meant to show this picture, but so here, this is the example I wanted to show you. So this is a paper from 2004, so exactly 20 years ago, which is co-authored with Matt Jackson, and which is entitled They're the Effects of Social Networks on Employment and Inequality. And so just from the title, of course you can see that this, employment and inequality, you can see that this is really a macroeconomics paper, of course, right? In fact, it's sort of given the focus on inequality, it's in a way a paper in heterogeneous agent macroeconomics. You can sort of see exactly the relation. So I'm obviously a little bit not entirely serious here when I say this, but the serious point is this goes to show the extreme breadth of Tony's work. And I just wanted to sort of briefly tell you about this paper and recommend you take a look in particular for the macroeconomists here, because I think you'll really like it. So this is really an absolutely beautiful paper, sort of a chef's kiss, kind of beautiful, which has this very simple starting point. Namely that when people search for jobs, they get most of the information about job offers and so on from their social networks, so from people they know. So it's word of mouth. And then Tony then thinks about the implications of that for employment and inequality across different groups of the population. In particular, he isolates this really interesting contagion effect, they call it, namely that small differences in employment prospects across population groups may get amplified via these social networks. So, for example, if you take 2 socioeconomic groups, say blacks and whites, then the idea is that if a black person drops out of the labor force for some reason, this is obviously bad for that person, but it's not only bad for that person, but also for the other people in this person's social network, which tend to be primarily or overrepresented by black people. And that's because the network of the other people in that person's network then is no longer as useful as a source of information about jobs. And they show that this kind of mechanism has the potential to really amplify employment differences and inequality differences across groups. Okay? And so to me, that's really sort of a very profound and deep idea with lots of important implications for macroeconomics. So yeah, please, especially the macro people, take a look at this paper, just great. Okay, I also wanted to briefly thank my co-authors. Turns out I was a bit surprised by this. I've co-authored with 47 people in the last few years, and I've learned so much from them, and obviously, wouldn't be here today without them. It's been just a great joy to collaborate with all these amazing economists. Here's the plan for today. So as the title said, there's going to be 8 lessons and a challenge. The lessons are going to be about monetary and fiscal policy, and there's going to be sort of 4 lessons for each. And I should say this first part in particular is with some of my, sort of based on work joined with some of my long-term co-authors, in particular Greg Kaplan, Gianluca Violante, Peter Maxted, David Leibson, Felipe Alves also. The second part, the challenge, is going to be newer. I think I'm going to spend probably more than half of my time, hopefully, on the challenge, that's sort of the new stuff. And it's going to be about heterogeneous agent models with aggregate risk, out of which these sort of Hank models that John talked about are sort of a special case, but it's more general, and I'm going to sort of put it somewhat provocatively here, if you want, okay? And I'm going to, in the end, say basically that sort of what we're doing in terms of solving these models, or how we think about these models, sort of makes no sense, to put it a bit bluntly. And I'm going to point to a particular issue, and I'm going to say that problem is going to be a particular assumption, namely the assumption of rational expectations about equilibrium prices. Okay? And I'm going to argue that in these models, we should drop this assumption about rational expectations about equilibrium prices, and I'm going to sort of try to pose this challenge, which is, there's something else that should replace it, and I'm not quite sure yet what, and that's sort of the challenge I'm going to pose, but I'm going to spell out some criteria that I think are reasonable. Okay. So just for the non-macroeconomists in the room, so what is heterogeneous agent macroeconomics? The way I like to say it is sort of this approach of studying macro questions, so classic macro questions, what happens when the European Central Bank cuts interest rates, fiscal policy, long-term growth, and so on, in terms of distributions of microeconomic variables rather than what's sort of traditionally done, just macroeconomic aggregates. Typical examples of these kind of distributions would be, say, the distributions of income and wealth, but could be other distributions as well, say the cross-sectional firm size distribution. To me, this approach, which has obviously sort of grown a lot over the last maybe 20, 30 years, is attractive for 2 main reasons. So the first thing is sort of conceptually, what's nice is it provides this sort of integrated approach to both macro and distribution, so inequality at the same time, so studying those jointly. And the second reason is perhaps even more importantly, that sort of empirically, it provides this integrated approach to taking into account both micro and macro data. And the very simple idea, really put in a maybe somewhat fuzzy way, is maybe there's just a lot more micro data than macro data, and maybe as macroeconomists we can learn something from working with this micro data. What tends to come out of this literature, I would say in a nutshell at a very high level, is that there's a sort of a very rich interaction between distribution or inequality on the one hand and the macroeconomy on the other hand. So on the one hand, sort of macroeconomic shocks and policies, they affect the distribution, but then the sort of additional interesting thing is that these distributional effects then feed back into the macroeconomy and matter for the macro outcomes. So it matters what's going on under the hood at the micro level. So maybe put a bit differently, I sometimes like to say it like this to my students in particular, sort of the right way I think to think is that really the macroeconomy is a distribution, so this very high dimensional object that somehow moves around over time and gets hit by shocks in policy, and that's what we need to think about rather than just some macroeconomic aggregates. Okay, so today I'm going to focus in particular on these heterogeneous agent models for monetary and fiscal policy analysis. Joan already said it, these are then sometimes called HANK models, which stands for Heterogeneous Agent New Keynesian models, which just means that we study this, we merge this heterogeneous agent literature that's been around obviously since the early 90s with this other literature that's also been around for quite some time, which is this literature studying macro models with nominal rigidities, so sticky prices and wages, so these new Keynesian models. And so put them together, interesting stuff happens. We then, what I'm going to do today is I'm going to flesh out some of the predictions of these HANK models and then contrast them also with the more traditional approaches that people have used in the macro literature. First, these sort of the representative agent counterpart to these models, the representative agent New Keynesian models, or for short, we sometimes like to use the acronym RANK. And then also the sort of even more traditional, if you want, old Keynesian models. So here I mean what we sometimes teach our undergrads, so Keynesian cross and ISLM. Just some background readings. I'm going to mostly skip this. These slides, by the way, are on my website, so you can look at them if you want. I just wanted to highlight one piece because I'm going to draw heavily on that later, which is this first item there. That's a piece that Greg, Jean-Luc, and I wrote jointly for the IMF has this Finance and Development magazine, and we tried to give sort of a high-level summary of how monetary policy works in HANK models, and that's where my 4 lessons for monetary policy are going to come from. Okay. So I wanted to start with some empirical evidence on consumption behavior. And the idea is going to be that when we route down these models, that's the type of evidence we're going to want to take seriously. Okay? And this is an example. We also going to want to take other evidence seriously, but this is sort of a primary example. This is about marginal propensities to consume out of income changes. So, for example, if you get fiscal stimulus, right? If I give you €1, how much of that do you eat? Okay. This particular figure here is from this nice paper from these authors down there, Peter Ganong and co. And what's nice about it, it summarizes a bunch of different studies in one graph. And the way to read this is, so these are marginal propensity to consume estimates from different papers, and then different papers, they basically, sorry, it's by liquid asset bin, so on the x-axis is liquid wealth, and then different papers put different people into different bins of liquid assets. And so the way to read this is on the left, there's terciles of liquid assets, in the middle there's quartiles, and on the right there's quintiles. And then there's sort of 2 key things that jump out of you from this graph. The first thing is just these MPCs are kind of high on average. Okay? In particular, relative to what you would get out of a traditional sort of permanent income hypothesis type macro model. So the MPCs here on average are maybe like, 0.25. So if I give you €1, you consume on average, people consume 25 cents of that euro. And the other thing that jumps out at you here is this downward slope, right, with liquid wealth, which is just to say that people with lower liquid wealth have higher marginal propensity to consume. Which maybe makes intuitive sense if you think these people, say they're at the bottom, they live hand to mouth or something like that. Okay. The other type of evidence I wanted to show you is evidence on how people respond not to income changes, but to interest rate changes. Okay, this is from a paper by Cloyne, Ferrer, and Surico down there. And they did this both for the United Kingdom, that's on top, and for the United States, that's on the bottom. And basically, they estimate how people respond to interest rate changes induced by monetary policy. And they split people in the population by whether they have a mortgage on the left, whether they outright own their houses, or whether they rent their houses, okay? And as you may expect, the finding is basically the group of the population that responds a lot is people there on the left with a mortgage, okay? And they respond more in particular than people that outright own their home. They interpret that as sort of a cash flow effect. If you have debt and the interest rates are lower, that's good for you. They find, somewhat interestingly, the other group of people that also responds a lot is people who are renting, so who are not owning a house, and the way they interpret that is as a result of general equilibrium effects working through labor income. So the idea is people who are renting houses tend to be poor, maybe have high marginal propensity to consume. When the central bank stimulates the economy, in the end, through general equilibrium effects, indirect effects, this increases labor incomes, puts people in their pocket, and they eat out of that. Okay, so I wanted to get to these 4 lessons for monetary policy. Before I do that, I just wanted to step back a little bit and sort of, to give you a benchmark, explain again, how monetary policy works in these representative agent New Keynesian model. And in a nutshell, the way it works in the representative agent models is it's all about intertemporal substitution. Okay, so when the central bank cuts interest rates, the way this works essentially, people think, oh, now it's a bad time to save, it's a good time to borrow, I'm going to spend more. Okay? Somewhat more mathematically, maybe if you want, the key equation in these kind of models is there's a unconstrained representative agent, and she's on her Euler equation and substitutes intertemporally very strongly. In these models, there are also indirect effects. In particular, because the representative agent intertemporally substitutes and spends more, that pushes up aggregate demand. That means firms have to produce more to meet that demand. That means firms are going to hire more. That puts more labor income in people's pocket, and that gives you an additional increase in consumption. However, it turns out that in these representative agent models, these second round or indirect general equilibrium effects are tiny. Okay? Another way of saying this maybe is in these representative agent New Keynesian models, even though they sort of have Keynesian in their name, they aren't really very Keynesian at all, in the following sense that you may remember maybe from your undergrad or what you teach your undergrads, right? When we teach, say, the Keynesian cross, there's this idea of like an impulse and a multiplier, where, say, the impulse here would be that you cut interest rates and then you have a multiplier effect. In traditional representative Asian New Keynesian models, essentially, it's all about the impulse, and the multiplier is very, very small. Okay, it's all about the impulse, it's the direct effect, people intertemporally substitute, and then there are, general equilibrium amplification effects, multiplier effects, but these are very, very, very small. Okay. In terms of equations, here's what this kind of Euler equation looks like. This is straight from Jordi Gali's textbook. Here, this on the bottom is the log linearized Euler equation. And what's sort of noteworthy there is that there's really just one parameter, this 1 over sigma here. So the intertemporal elasticity of substitution that determines how much aggregate consumption increases when you cut interest rates. And it's sort of this very hardwired effect. Okay. So what's wrong with this intertemporal substitution logic? Well, really only one thing, which is that it's sort of inconsistent with what we know from empirical evidence of the type I've shown you before. In particular, as I've shown you before, sort of not everyone looks like they're these permanent income consumers that smooth transitory income shocks. Instead, people tend to have high marginal propensity to consume, in particular at the bottom of the liquid wealth distribution. There seem to be many hand-to-mouth households with high MPCs, and then what you tend to also see is that for these people, low sensitivity to interest rates. Furthermore, as I also showed you, there's a non-trivial distribution of MPCs across the population, so lots of heterogeneity. Maybe you want to take that into account as well. What we do in these Hank models, right, is we take this empirical evidence seriously. When you do that, and I'll explain this in more detail later, you get pretty immediately much smaller direct effects through interest rates. Sort of this impulse effect that I talked about is much smaller. On the flip side, however, you get a much larger indirect or general equilibrium effects through labor income. Why is that? It's just straight from the fact that people have high marginal propensity to consume, right? So there are some people who intertemply substitute or increase spending in response to interest rate changes, say people with a mortgage or something like this, and that then sends in motion these general equilibrium amplification effects, which are very powerful because MPCs are high. So in a sense, like it's much more sort of old Keynesian, I'll come back to that later, where the impulse is smaller but the multiplier is larger. Okay. The other thing that matters, that then happens, is that the income and wealth distribution and redistribution in response to shocks matters for the aggregate outcome. Okay. Here's a graph that probably some of you may have seen before, because I've used this a number of times over the last few years to just kind of summarize a bit how this works. So again, you can think about, if you think about the transmission of monetary policy to consumption, you can think about these direct effects or impulse effects or partial equilibrium effects, and these indirect effects or general equilibrium effects or multiplier effects. And essentially, in the traditional representative agent model, it's all about that branch there on the left. So it's all about intertemporal substitution, whereas instead in these Hank models, it's much richer. In particular, we emphasize alternative direct effects. These are effects working through household balance sheets, for example. Say people with large mortgages will respond a lot to interest rate changes. And then B, you get these indirect general equilibrium effects. In particular, those working through labor income, but maybe also through asset prices and so on. Okay? In a nutshell, it sort of just paints a much richer view of the world than this representative agent models based on basically this single equation, this Euler equation. Okay, so the world is more complicated, basically, in a nutshell. Okay, so let me come to the lessons of monetary policy. So this is basically straight from this IMF piece that I wrote together with Greg and Gianluca. Now I'll go a little bit fast here. Because you can look this up. I just want to kind of give you a flavor. So the first lesson I already kind of said, which we call here predicting indirect policy impacts. So because people have high marginal propensity to consume in these models, again, you get that these indirect effects, which are tiny in the representative agent models, so these multiplier effects, are much more important and tend to be larger in these Hank models than the direct effects of interest rate cuts. So people respond primarily not to the interest rate changes, but to how much money they have in their pockets, basically. The second lesson is what we call here, some ships are lifted higher, others are sunk. So I'd say there's this sort of a traditional view that in particular comes out of these representative agent models, that monetary policy sort of is like a rising tide which raises all ships. So it's sort of good for everyone on average. Okay? What happens in Hank models is quite different. In particular, monetary policy, it's maybe easy to see, has larger distributional effects. Okay? Interest rate cuts are very good for some people and very bad for others. So say if you have a lot of debt, like either a mortgage or a student loan, then maybe you like interest rate cuts, but maybe if you're a saver who's living off the interest income, you don't like interest rate cuts. So that's like an income effect, basically. And then furthermore, what happens is these distributional effects feed into the aggregate effect, so they don't sort of wash out. And so what we say here is that sort of these Hank models force you to sort of let go of the idea that we can cleanly separate stabilization from redistribution, which maybe is an idea that you would have if you think about a representative agent model. Third lesson, fiscal footprints matter. So in representative agent models, at least, so this is for the macroeconomists, putting aside ideas like fiscal theory of the price level, there's this idea that you can kind of separate monetary and fiscal policy relatively cleanly, and monetary policy should just do their own thing, and fiscal policy should just do their own thing without putting too much weight on what the other does. In Hank models, this doesn't work so much anymore, okay? The reason for this is that in Hank models, you don't have a property that you get in representative Asian models, which is Ricardian equivalence. And so as a result, what happens is that when the central bank cuts interest rate, this affects the government's budget constraints. Say if a government issues debt, then lower interest rates are good for the government because now they have more fiscal space, and then it matters what the government exactly does in response to that. Fourth lesson, I think, is kind of important. Given the sort of second lesson in particular that I said there's larger distributional effects of monetary policy, some people, I think, are sometimes tempted to say, oh, we should use monetary policy for distributional purposes. There's sometimes these discussions, should the ECB change its mandate to take into account inequality and so on. We sort of come down on the side that, no, they probably shouldn't do that. And the reason for that is monetary policy is just a very blunt tool for redistribution, okay? You just have this one interest rate. You can't really target very well. And Hank models, I'll come back to this in a second, tell us that in a sense fiscal policy is probably the better suited tool for this task because you can target it basically. Okay, so let me come to the 4 lessons for fiscal policy. As you may have anticipated, what's obviously key for fiscal policy is getting the marginal propensities to consume right, which I sort of argued that these Hank models manage. I've already kind of said this a little bit. There's sort of an interesting thing that happens when you model these MPCs, which is, in a sense, the model behavior in these Hank models resembles much more closely these sort of old Keynesian cross that we teach our undergrads. In particular, you get these sizable multiplier effects. However, there's an important difference. So this is not just us going back, 90 years back in time. There's a very important difference, which is these are obviously, microfounded modern macro models, dynamic models that make precise predictions about individuals' behavior, are not, at least in principle, subject to the Lucas critique, have predictions about inequality, and you can use them to think about welfare, like we like to do in modern macro models. There's a nice paper that makes these points cleanly here called the intertemporal Keynesian cross by Auclair, Rongley, and Straub that sort of makes this connection to the old Keynesian cross in a simple way. Okay. So now with this, let me come to the 4 lessons for fiscal policy. The first lesson sort of picks up on the 4th lesson from the previous slide. We're going to say that, so again, the question is what's the right tool for redistribution or insurance? We're going to say that fiscal policy is the right tool as opposed to monetary policy. The second lesson is sort of related, which is about how powerful is fiscal policy for aggregate demand management. And you have, in the traditional rank models, the representative Asian models, you tend to have this sort of clear pecking order that at least as long as you're away from things like the zero lower bound, sort of monetary policy should do the job most of the time, okay? And fiscal policy, you should sort of only use it when you're at the zero lower bound. The reason for this is Ricardian equivalence, okay? In the Hank models, in contrast, you break Ricardian equivalence because people are constrained and so on. And then you have these kind of results in the literature, these sort of equivalence results that basically say, fiscal policy can do a lot, in particular, basically, in terms of aggregate demand management, anything that monetary policy can do, you can also do with fiscal policy, okay? There's a nice paper by Christian Wolff which has exactly this result. The other thing you can do with fiscal policy, of course, is to target to particular people, and maybe you want to target to people with high MPCs. That's a way to get more bang for the buck. If you do that, you would also think maybe that's a good thing for distributional reasons because the people with high MPCs tend to be people with low liquid wealth, and so you maybe want to target those and help them. Lesson 3, I'm going to speed up a little bit here, is about deficit finance fiscal stimulus. And there's this strong property in these models that deficit finance fiscal stimulus tends to be at least partly self-financing, meaning that you don't have to raise taxes as much in the future to repay that debt that you took out to finance that stimulus as you may have otherwise thought. Again, the reason for this is that you kill this Ricardian equivalence in this model. There's a very provocative paper by Angeletos, Chen, and Wolf, which basically says that under some conditions, fiscal stimulus can be completely self-financing. I would say you don't really have to go as far as buying that sort of extreme prediction, but there's definitely always this tendency to have some self-financing nature. The final lesson is maybe in a sense the most important one, which is where do really the welfare gains from fiscal policy come from? There's a very nice paper on this by Anmol Bandari, Tom Sargent, Mike Golosoff, and David Evans. And they asked this question in one of these Hank models, and what they find is that the largest welfare gains really come not sort of from fine-tuning aggregate demand a bit, it's really just from providing insurance in a recession to households that are hard hit. And this is especially true in asymmetric shocks like COVID, where you have particular sections of the population, say hospitality workers, that are just out of a living. So if you can just provide some insurance to them, that's helpful. But it's also true more broadly in other recessions. Okay, so that was sort of this overview. Now let me come to the challenge part, where I'm going to call it here sort of the trouble with rational expectations in heterogeneous Asian models. Okay, so again, this is about heterogeneous Asian models with aggregate risk, out of which Hank models are a special case. The macroeconomists here will obviously notice that there's these very classic papers by Krusell-Smith and Watert and Hahn from the late 90s that study this, and as is, I think, well known since then, there's a key problem in terms of solving these models, which is that the combination of rational expectations and general equilibrium means that the cross-sectional distributions of across households and firms enter the decision problems of these households or firms. So mathematically, you have a Bellman equation where a distribution, so an infinite dimensional object, is a state variable. What's sort of interesting about this is, if you think about it, this is true even though in these models the households and firms do not really care about the distributions at all, and instead they only care about prices. So this is, these models, right, are completely standard competitive equilibrium where every household or firm is atomistic and they just take prices given, but nevertheless the distribution enters as a state variable. In recent work there have been sort of very impressive advances solving such models, and I'll describe those a little bit later, but this still really holds back the heterogeneous Asian literature. For example, there's just some questions that we really cannot answer with our current heterogeneous Asian model. So basically, whenever aggregate nonlinearities and aggregate shocks are important, it just becomes extremely costly and hard to solve these models. So for example, in the recent inflation debate, maybe people thought that nonlinearities and Phillips curves were important, or if you want to think about financial crises or something like this, and these sort of Brunner-Meyer, Sannikov, Vahe, Krishnamurti type models where you have these multiple regions, like you cannot write a heterogeneous Asian model like this with these strong aggregate nonlinearities, or you cannot really solve it well. So what I want to do in the rest of the talk is sort of say, hey, maybe it's worth taking a step back here and thinking about, what's this problem here that we're trying to solve, and I'm going to come down as saying sort of we're spending a lot of intellectual and computational horsepower, which in a sense is really kind of a bit of a nonsensical problem, okay? And then I'm going to say the issue is rational expectations, and what we should do is go back to the drawing board and replace rational expectations about equilibrium prices in these models, sort of on pragmatic grounds, right? So that we really want to just solve these models. Even if you have no problem with rational expectations, you may want to do that basically. Okay, here's the plan for the rest of the talk. So I just wanted to briefly sort of go back to the roots a little bit of rational expectations, as sort of Muth and Lucas and Sargent and so on. And I'm going to tell you the whole development of rational expectations was really all about how to form expectations about equilibrium prices. Okay, and I'm going to do the second part, which is I'm going to say that in heterogeneous agent models, then what rational expectations means for how people form expectations about equilibrium prices kind of makes no sense in my view. And then I'm hopefully going to have time to discuss a little bit what maybe candidates for what should discuss this and spell out these criteria. Okay, so back to the roots a little bit. This is some sort of history of economic thought, if you want. And so back to John Muth, who has this very nice 1961 paper, who was really the father of rational expectations, and then also to Bob Lucas at Prescott, Tom Sargent and co, who really sort of took that idea and ran with it and applied it to all these important questions. And so again, the key here is going to be that better modeling of expectations of equilibrium prices really was the central goal in the development of rational expectations at the time. Here's sort of first piece of evidence. This is the Muth 1961 paper. If you look at the title, it has basically equilibrium prices in the title, so it's called Rational Expectation and the Theory of Price Movements. And if you look at the paper, he has like this one main example that he uses to explain his theory, and it's basically this simple model of market equilibrium. There's demand, basically C here for consumption, that's the demand curve, and then there's supply P for production, and then there's a market clearing condition, so production equals consumption. And then it's all about, how do you form expectations about these equilibrium prices. Okay. Bob Lucas has written some nice things about this. The first quote here is from Bob's Nobel lecture. He sort of says, in 1960-style macroeconomic models, the implied behavior of actual equilibrium prices and incomes bore no relation to and were in general grossly inconsistent with the price expectations that the theory imputed to individual agents, right? These were these models back in the day then where people had these backward-looking adaptive expectations and then, or something like that, and then if you simulate them, then the behavior of the actual equilibrium prices is just totally different from the expectations. And then he has this other thing here in another paper from the 1980s where he says, one needs a principle to reconcile the price distribution implied by the market equilibrium with the distribution used by agents to form their own views of the future, and then he says the solution is rational expectations. Second thing that's worth looking at is this paper here by Lucas and Prescott from 1971. Absolutely beautiful paper, sort of foundational paper. In particular, that paper, so here called Investment Under Uncertainty, was really sort of the paper that first spells out rational expectations the way we now understand it, I think, in modern macro. In particular, Muth, if you look at the equations in this paper, is really only about the price means, the expectations of the price means and the ones generated by the market equilibrium being consistent. Lucas and Prescott really make it about the entire price distribution, the sort of entire density, the way we understand this now. Okay, this paper here, there's a simple model in this. If you read this, this is basically a model of a competitive industry. There's a fluctuating demand curve. There's some demand shocks. Okay, and then there's an equilibrium price, and then it's all about how do firms forecast prices, and they need to do that because they need to make an investment decision. Okay, if you read this, and the key thing here is this. They say that the assumption we're going to make is that actual and anticipated prices have the same probability distribution, or that price expectations are rational. Okay, and they say they have this footnote. They took it from Muth but generalized it. And then it has all the things we normally have or often have in modern macro. Bellman equations and all that stuff. And so that's really all in that beautiful Lucas Prescott paper. Okay. Another important goal of developing rational expectations at the time, what they always emphasized when you read this is that they wanted to have these sort of operational, is the word they always use, theories. So this is again from Lucas Prescott 71. They say sort of by imposing rational explanation, we obtain an operational investment theory. And there's another quote that I particularly like a lot. This is from Bob Lucas again. He has this nice thing where he basically says, our task in sort of all of macroeconomics, if you want, is to sort of write a Fortran program, okay? That will sort of accept policy and spit something out. And so it's again this sort of idea that you really want to have something operational that you can compute. Okay, so now with this background, let me come to heterogeneous agent models and think about what rational expectations mean there. Okay, here's the intuition for what I'm going to tell you at a sort of very high level, okay? So here's how this is going to work, okay? Suppose I live in one of our heterogeneous agent models, and suppose I care about the future time paths of some interest rate. Say I want to buy a house and I want to figure out what's going to happen to mortgage interest rates going forward. So I only really care about this sort of a time series there. Then what I would do if I live in that model, and given that I have rational expectations, I'd realize that in equilibrium, this interest rate depends on the entire cross-sectional income and wealth distribution in the economy. So in particular, say, for the European Union, you need to know what's every single European citizen going to do in terms of investment, savings decision, buying houses, and so on. Okay. Then I'm going to say, okay, because I understand this dependence, and that's just the outcome of equilibrium, because I have rational expectations, I'm going to say, well, in order to forecast interest rates, I now need to actually forecast the entire cross-sectional distribution, okay? The problem with that, of course, that's an extremely high-dimensional object, and that's why this sort of computational nightmare arises, okay? Now, that makes the solution extremely hard or impossible, but I guess what I kind of want to say a little bit is, let's maybe take a step back and say, do we actually think people do this? Do you, when you try to forecast prices, say, hey, these prices, they depend on the distribution of what everyone does, and it's not just in this room, but the entire country, the world, and now I need to forecast this entire distribution. I don't. Next, I wanted to just explain this in a little bit more detail using a specific example and flesh this out with some equations. Okay, I'm going to do an example here which is completely textbook stuff. In particular, the prices that people are going to need to forecast here are some wages and interest rates. And I'm going to start with a model without heterogeneity, so a representative agent economy. It's really just going to be a real business cycle model to begin with, and I'm going to add heterogeneity to this afterwards, okay? And the reason for doing the representative agent case is mostly sort of pedagogical, so you sort of understand why it's easier in the representative agent case. Okay, so here's the model. This is really, completely textbook standard stuff. So you have some preferences. So there's a representative agent, right? Some preferences over consumption and hours worked. There's a representative firm. There's some TFP shocks, so that's the Z there. The time horizon here I denote by capital T. I'm going to allow it to be either finite or infinite. The standard is, of course, that it's infinite. I'm going to sometimes want it to be finite because I'm going to have a little example with 2 time periods later where you can see some things nicely. Okay? But apart from that, right, this is literally just the real business cycle model out of your textbook. Okay. You can, of course, write a competitive equilibrium in this real business cycle model. There's different decentralizations, but let's take the one where the firms own the capital. You're going to then have households maximizing, taking as prices as given. You're going to have, and they solve some consumption saving problem, right? You have firms maximizing, taking prices as given. They solve this investment problem, and then markets clear. Okay, so it's textbook stuff. Okay, so let's think briefly, how this equilibrium here works, and in particular, you can see here that you know, what the households and the firms need to do here, because they live in a stochastic world, because there's these aggregate TFP shocks, is they need to forecast wages and interest rates, so these prices, okay, because that matters for their saving and investment decisions. So how do they actually do that? So let's focus on the wage for now. Then basically the way this works is, right, so from the households problem, basically you get a labor supply curve, right? That's just the labor supply as a function of wages and maybe the representative household's wealth. Similarly, from the firm's maximization problem, you get a labor demand curve. And then, you know, market's clear, labor demand equals labor supply, and then you get an equilibrium wage that will depend on what the capital stock is in the economy and aggregate productivity is. And note in particular, it's sort of this price function that maps these states into whatever the prices are. And what people then do is basically, because they have rational expectations, they understand this price function here, and they understand this dependence, how it depends on K and Z, and then they say, okay, we're just going to forecast Z rather than the wages directly. Okay? Note here, even in this representative Asian model, it's sort of, the equilibrium is actually pretty complicated already. In particular, these agents have quite a high ability to think through the equilibrium in this economy. Okay. You know, how do you solve these models? We know how to do this in representative Asian models. There's, I think, sort of broadly two types of solution methods, at least sort of global solution methods, if you don't want to just like linearize. One is to tackle the competitive equilibrium directly. That's actually pretty hard for the reasons I just told you, that you have to sort of work with these price functions. There's a much easier way, of course, in particular in a model like this with a representative Asian model, is you can solve it via a planning problem. In particular, you can say, oh, I know that in this model the first welfare theorem will hold, and so you can just sort of solve the planning problem. Of course, when you do that, the planning problem doesn't feature prices, so you kind of completely sidestep this key difficulty of having to forecast the equilibrium prices. Okay, so now let's add heterogeneity to this. Okay? And the key takeaway is going to be just adding this heterogeneity is going to make it infinitely more complicated. Literally in the sense that, infinitely in the sense that you have an infinite dimensional state variable. Okay, so here's how this works. So this is exactly the same problem as before, except that I added some idiosyncratic income risk Z here, little z, ZIT, the thing in blue. Okay, so that's, now the model is basically Crucell-Smith, 1998. And so you have this idiosyncratic risk, right, just for the non-macroeconomists. Sometimes you're employed, sometimes you're unemployed. That generates cross-sectional heterogeneity, that generates a cross-sectional wealth distribution, and so on. Okay? The firms are as before, there's just still a representative firm. Now you're going to have a market clearing, or a setup that's more complicated. In particular, what's going to matter is this cross-sectional distribution there, that I'm going to denote by G. That's the joint distribution of wealth and income. Okay? You have to kind of track that. And the market clearing conditions are going to be the same as before, except that sort of the capital supply and the labor supply, now you have to integrate across the distribution. Note, I've already said this, the households or the firms here do not really care about this distribution, right? You know, look at the problem of the households, for example. There's no G in there anywhere. They really only care about the prices. This is, again, completely standard competitive equilibrium. Now, think a bit how the wage determination and how people need to forecast and form expectations about equilibrium prices works in this model. Okay? So now, and let's do it for the wage again, but it's sort of the same for interest rates. Now what's going to happen is that, say, a household's labor supply here won't just depend on the wage, it also depends on these idiosyncratic state variables. So in particular, household's labor supply will tend to depend on the household's wealth and household's idiosyncratic income state. Okay? Because of that, now when we look at these market clearing conditions, you have to integrate across a distribution here. And because of that, the equilibrium wages here in this economy will now depend on the entire cross-sectional distribution of wealth. Okay? And note this is a generic feature of any heterogeneous agent model that you write down. You can make up special cases where it's not quite true, but generically this will happen, right? If you have non-trivial heterogeneity, the equilibrium prices will depend on the distribution. It happens here with the interest rate as well. So now think about what this means for people having to forecast prices. Okay? And here, this is where writing the special case with 2 time periods kind of comes in handy. So you see this clearly there. So now again, there's just 2 time periods, 0 and 1. And I wrote sort of the value function here of a household in period 0 with wealth A, idiosyncratic productivity Z, aggregate productivity capital Z, and they solve this consumption saving problem, how much to save to the second period. Okay. So the problem in the first period is kind of standard. The key thing here to look at is what happens in the second period, and what that then implies for the first period. Okay. So in particular, you can see in the second period, you're going to have the equilibrium prices here, W1 and R1 show up, that in equilibrium will depend on the entire cross-sectional distribution G, as I just told you. And then the key thing is, because people understand this, because they have rational expectations, when they solve their consumption saving problem in the first period, and then if you look at the expectations operator there in the value function in the first period, this expectation is taken with respect to not just the aggregate state Z, which is really the thing that's stochastic, and what drives things, and at the aggregate level, but instead the entire cross-sectional distribution G. Okay? It's because they understand that the wages and the interest rates, these prices are going to be these price functions of the distribution. Okay? And the firms, when they make the investment decision, do a similar thing. Okay? Again, this makes the solution sort of hard or impossible, and it becomes even more complicated if you have an infinite horizon problem. But again, like, the question I want to pose is sort of, do we really think people do this? And I sort of, I'm going to say maybe not. Okay. So how do people solve these heterogeneous agent models then, given this big problem there, right? So again, like, what does this mean? It means you have a cross-section distribution infinite dimensional object as a state variable in a Bellman equation, basically. And it's hard to compute Bellman equations with infinite dimensional state variables. Impossible, really. Okay, so what do people do then, actually? We do solve these models somehow. Well, they do really one of 3 things. So linearization or MIT shocks. I'm going to explain what that is in a second. Sort of this method that's really due to Crusell-Smith from the 90s, or some papers do tackle the full rational expectations equilibrium. Okay, so let me do this in turn. So this is really the typical approach to linearization or MIT shocks. It's a typical approach in the Hank literature. So MIT shocks, sorry, just for the non-macroeconomist, what that means is you think there's no aggregate risk whatsoever, then completely unexpectedly this shock happens, and then afterwards you have perfect foresight about what happens to this. The reason this is called MIT shocks is, I think, some people in Chicago and Minnesota making fun of some people at MIT doing this sort of Rudy Dornbush doing this in the 80s, I think. But it's actually a very useful tool. Like, all macroeconomists I know love MIT shocks. Okay. And so what do you do when you do that, or when you linearize? You basically eliminate the aggregate uncertainty. Okay, so you essentially have certainty, or when you linearize, that's a well-known thing, that if you linearize, you're going to have certainty equivalence for the prices which are the stochastic aggregate variables. So in a sense, you again completely sidestep this key difficulty, which is that these prices are stochastic. So this works very nicely for lots of things. I've used it in all my heterogeneous agent papers. for monetary policy, for example. But again, it's not suitable if you want to think about aggregate nonlinearities and you think maybe asset pricing or stuff like that. Okay. The other thing you can do is, and let me do this one first, is actually tackle the full rational expectations equilibrium. And there have been some extremely impressive advances in recent literature. And I'm listing some papers here. And these are some of the brightest people I know, and they've come up with these like amazing computational methods, combining really sort of frontier math with sort of impressive computational methods, putting on these supercomputers, using machine learning, what have you, and they do actually get quite far in solving these models. You still have to make some approximation, obviously, because you can't solve infinite dimensional problems. And you can sort of solve it, but it's just extremely slow and like a little bit impractical. And what I kind of want to say is, maybe we shouldn't, spend all this intellectual computational horsepower on solving these kind of problems in this way. Okay. Because really it's sort of this nonsensical problem in a sense. The other thing, of course, you can do is Krusell-Smith. So what do Krusell-Smith do is they basically say, okay, rather than forecasting prices by forecasting this entire cross-sectional distributions, what people do is, or the assumption, the simplification you do is you say you forecast prices by forecasting moments of distributions. Typically this will be just the first moment, so the mean of the distribution. So for example, here in this model that I had, it would be the A bar, the mean of the wealth distribution instead of the entire cross-sectional distribution. Of course, you could take higher dimensional moments as well. You can give this a nice bounded rationality interpretation, which is a little bit where I want to go, I think. But what I want to say is sort of, again, a little bit, do we think that people do that, sort of, forecast moments to forecast prices? I also kind of don't think so, and maybe we can do better. Okay. So taking stock briefly, and then I'll, spell out these criteria a little bit. Again, coming back to Muth and Lucas and co., when developing these rational expectations models, that the goal here was really to have these operational macro theories. And I would say rational expectations have been a huge success in the context of the representative agent literature. Okay, that achieves exactly this goal, makes these the computation feasible, puts a lot of structure and discipline on these models. What I want to say though is that in rational in heterogeneous agent models, with aggregate risk, rational expectations really mean that in a sense these models are not really operational, in the sense that it's just what rational expectation does, it sort of attributes to people this extreme ability to think through this equilibrium, which then means that people in these models forecast prices by forecasting distributions, which means that it also becomes extremely hard or impossible to solve these models. So what I want to say is, basically, we should go back to the drawing board here, and we should replace the rational expectations assumption about equilibrium prices in these heterogeneous agent models, mostly just, for pragmatic reasons, because it will just make the solution a lot easier. But there's also this other thing, which is that it could also make these models a lot more empirically realistic. So it's sort of what I write here is potential payoff. This is, you could maybe kill two birds with one stone, right? So you make the models both operational on the one hand, so meaning the solution feasible, but you also make them more interesting and more empirically grounded. Normally in economics, right, there's a trade-off between these two, right? You make a model more realistic, you make it harder to solve. In this case, I think there's sort of this kill two birds with one stone aspect. Okay. So if I still have some time, sort of what should replace the rational expectations? So let me briefly talk about that. So I want to be clear up front. This is a case of I only know the problem, not the solution. Oops, sorry about that. So all I'm going to be able to do here is sort of spell out some criteria that I find reasonable, and then the hope is that all these people who have done amazing works on expectation formation. Maybe we'll come back together with the heterogeneous Asian macro crowd and figure something out. Okay. So the common element of all the solutions I'm going to propose, or I think where we should be going, is some element of we just want to form expectations about equilibrium prices directly, okay, rather than forecasting distribution or moments of distribution to forecast the prices. That's in a sense the very natural solution here. It's, again, to be clear, different from rational expectations, and so you won't get exactly the rational expectations here. And the key difficulty here is going to be, and I'll talk about this in more detail, how to discipline then these probability distributions to compute the equilibrium price expectations. Note, I would in these models keep rational expectations about non-equilibrium variables, for example, idiosyncratic productivity shocks. Why? Because there's no sort of problem here in terms of solving it. Again, it's sort of replacing the rational expectations about equilibrium prices on pragmatic grounds rather than hating rational expectations for some reason. Okay, so here's the way to do this in this two-period model. I think that's why this two-period model is useful. You can see very clearly how this works. This was the equations I've already shown you, so you have this cross-sectional distribution G there showing up if you have rational expectations. I think the natural thing to do, right, is to just say, hey, why don't we just, rather than thinking through these price functions and then forecasting G, why don't we just try to form expectations about prices directly, okay? You can see just, putting there in the expectations operator there, making that about, integrating over probability distributions about future prices rather than future distributions. So you immediately transfer a problem that's an infinite dimensional problem here. That's just, now you have to just forecast two numbers, okay? Note this is different from Crucell-Smith, where you forecast prices using moments. There's one little exception, which sometimes people do, we can talk about later maybe. Sometimes people do this clever thing actually, where they say, oh, you can actually use the prices as the moments of the distribution that you forecast. And that's a little bit similar to maybe where we go, but I think we could just do this a bit more systematically. Okay, so the challenge here is, of course, going to be how do you discipline these price expectations, right? So now you throw out rational expectations, what do you do instead? You need some probability distribution to compute these expected value functions. And so I wrote it here abstractly, in terms of a price P. And so how do you do that? And the challenge in particular is going to be navigating, I guess, what people have sometimes called the wilderness of non-rational expectations. This is a phrase due to, I think, Chris Sims originally and Tom Sargent. So Tom has this very nice AA presidential address where he says has these nice quotes here. He, for example, says, there's such a bewildering variety of ways to imagine discrepancies between objective and subjective distributions, which is, of course, what deviations from rational expectations are about. Or this one I like even better. He says, this is a footnote in the paper, he says, there's an infinite number of ways to be wrong, but only one way to be correct. Okay, so that's exactly the heart of the matter, right? And he also says that, what's nice about rational expectations is it impose a lot of discipline, and therefore, he's in favor of these more cautious modifications of rational expectations. And I think I sort of share that. I do think the discipline of rational expectations is a good thing. Okay, so here are the three criteria I came up with for how we may want to discipline these expectation formation or these probability distributions. And maybe when we talk later, you have other criteria. Obviously, the more criteria, the better, because that puts more structure. Okay, so the first criterion obviously should be to actually simplify the solution of the heterogeneous agent model, so actually make them operational, which was the whole thing I'm saying that's sort of difficult. The second thing is some consistency with empirical evidence. In particular, there's now this huge literature on expectations formation from using survey data. And the third thing is some consistency with actual equilibrium prices. So let me flesh this out a little bit more. So the first thing is you want to actually simplify the solution. That actually imposes quite a lot of structure and discipline already, or rules out some approaches you may have wanted to use. In particular, this sort of, you can see, eliminates pretty quickly any model of expectation formation that nests rational expectations as a special case. Why? Because that's a special case we can't solve. And so if we can't solve the special case, we can't solve the more general problem either. So in particular, there's some models in the literature that have this form there. There's some parameter theta, such that if you set it equal to 0, you get rational expectations as a special case. A prominent example of this is, at least the way it's typically written, diagnostic expectations. Right, there's always this parameter theta. Again, when you set theta equal to 0, you get the rational expectation. This wouldn't work here. You can maybe do other versions of diagnostic expectations relative to some other benchmarks, but not relative to rational expectations. Second, consistency with empirical evidence. So there's been this huge, booming, very interesting, exciting literature studying survey expectations in particular. There's this nice macroannual survey, for example, that surveys this literature, but this has really exploded over the last sort of 10 years, I want to say. And so obviously we should sort of take into account that empirical evidence, I think. And there's something interesting you actually find in these data sets normally, which is, say if you ask people about inflation expectations, is there's huge heterogeneity about these inflation expectations, say. Right? Some people say very high numbers, some people say very low numbers. That's obviously very different from rational expectations, where with rational expectations, everyone will have the same probability distribution. Tom Sargent has this nice quip, again, that rational expectations is a communist assumption because it imposes the same probability distribution for everyone. So this would be exactly saying maybe we don't need that communism here. Okay. Finally, this consistency with actual equilibrium prices. So this comes back to Lucas and Sargent and so on, obviously. So, obviously we don't want to go back, all the way to before that and be subject to all these criticisms that Bob Lucas wrote in the 70s and 80s. So we do want to have that the probability distribution that people use to form expectations is in the end not too far in some sense from the probability distribution of actual equilibrium prices. Okay, so you want some sort of a fixed point nature. Okay, but perhaps we don't need consistency of the entire probability distribution, maybe just the means or something like that. Okay, so we do want that if the government suddenly does some other policy that people update their expectations in some way. We don't want the Lucas critique completely. Okay, let me. This is sort of the last slide I have. Just throw out some I think potentially promising directions in a totally non-structured, unordered way. This is totally non-exhaustive, but interesting things I've come across that I thought maybe one could use. And as you will see, this has a sort of a very Catalan connection here, or a Barcelona connection, some of it. In particular, Albert Marcet has done a lot of work that seems maybe potentially relevant here. So in particular, there's these ideas of self-confirming equilibrium, least squares learning, internal rationality for people who know this. Other thing, this is the last one on the bottom, that I thought was kind of interesting. This is more with the empirical evidence. I saw this job market paper, I think, coming out of UPF. Here, this Shenzhen paper that has this interesting finding that people whose credit card applications or credit applications get rejected have different expectations from other people, in particular, a lot more pessimistic. So obviously, that's the type of thing that in a heterogeneous Asian model could be very interesting. So the key thing here, and this is probably a much longer list, the key thing here is all of these things, in particular the first three things, I think are very interesting in representative Asian models, but I think really you could have a potentially much larger payoff in heterogeneous Asian models. Why? Because, again, you not only make the models more realistic, but you can actually simplify the solution. Okay, so let me conclude. I hope I'm not too over time. So again, there was these two parts. The first one was about Hank models, and I guess I want to say that Hank models sort of change how we think about macroeconomic policy. There were these 4 lessons for each of monetary and fiscal policy, and then I spent a lot of time talking about rational expectations in heterogeneous Asian models, and I sort of said this is that we spend a lot of intellectual and computational horsepower solving what I think is a bit of a nonsensical problem, and we should really just sort of a little bit go back to the drawing board and replace this rational expectations assumption with something else. This is an open question, and again, I thought it'd be kind of fun and maybe productive to pose it as sort of a challenge. You know, what should we do instead? In particular, how should we navigate this wilderness, if you want, of rational expectations, away from rational expectations? And I sort of spelled out these 3 criteria and threw out some ideas, but I don't quite know how to do it, is the honest answer. Okay, right. Thank you very much for listening, and thanks again for the wonderful talk.
So, thanks, Ben, for this very inspiring lecture. We're a bit over time, and it's not your fault. It's because we started a bit late. So we're going to take like 2 questions, and I suggest we take them and then you answer them. So I see actually 2 of them there. So
yeah, maybe you can simplify your problem a bit by saying how can we complement rational expectations. So rational expectation is there and is very important. So I'm a microeconomist, Rosemary Nagel. I'm doing bounded rationality. And I mean, the macroeconomists know that level K is one possibility to tackle the problem of bounded rationality. And so you don't destroy other people's work. So for example, central banks, when they, they are considering, let's say, neo-Keynesian models, and they know if the system is very negative, if the system is negative, then you get nicer conversion than when it's positive. So you really need to know what is the rational expectation and how can you twist the parameters in such a way that the system becomes more stable. And that's all based on the theory. And macroeconomists have already used my way of thinking, and that's actually embracing. It's going from randomness to equilibrium, and everything in between is what people do. But people don't need even to know the system. They can just do adaptive expectations and all that stuff. So in experimental and macro-experimental economics, there's a lot of stuff that can help.
Okay, exciting. Yeah, perfect. That's exactly the type of thing I'm looking for. Thanks very much. I'm obviously aware of your work, but I haven't thought about this. But yeah, it sounds like we should talk. And yeah, I guess the question is, can that maybe, or the hope would be that this could maybe simplify the computation in particular of these models. Where again, right, like my primary motivation is really just I want to solve those damn models. Right? Like I want to do stuff with them, and you know, I'm a big fan of all this work, and so then if we somehow can combine these 2 things and again make it both more exciting and realistic and simplify the computation, that would be great. Thanks.
So thank you for the very persuasive talk. I just see a trap related to policy that I would like to know your thoughts about, which is if we really want to see who gets the expectations wrong and who's getting hurt from not doing the anticipation properly, then should policy reward them by kind of helping them overcome this failure to anticipate properly?
So I didn't fully understand.
So like if you have like heterogeneous, so we look at agents in a heterogeneous way, and then policy has to address the fact that some people are just unable to anticipate properly and form these expectations properly. Should policy then kind of protect them, which is what it should do, but protecting them means rewarding those who are not doing the expectations in a rational way, no?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question, I guess, right? This is, I think, there's lots of similar problems whenever people have some sort of a behavioral behavior. Is that should the governments then do something about it? So, and I guess it just depends on what you think is the sort of right social welfare function. Should you, do you take this sort of a paternalistic view where you say, okay, I know what the correct probability distribution is, and these are mistakes people make, and I should fix them, or maybe you don't, you think that's just part of people's behavior, and you don't necessarily have to take this paternalistic view. So yeah, I don't have a strong view on this in any way. That there's probably lots of people in the room. They're much better placed to answer this question, but I think it's an interesting question. Thanks.
Okay, so thanks again and congratulations again for the well-deserved prize. So we will close it here. Thank you.
Thank you.